All right, let's get into it. We're going to talk about a story of, well, a stolen crown, a victory parade for a battle someone else mostly fought, and how a nation's entire memory can be rewritten piece by piece for political gain.
Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we do the noble work of questioning official stories. And today we're looking at the Chinese Communist Party's Victory Lab version of the Second Sino-Japanese War. Now, according to the CCP, they basically carried the war on their backs, while a whole lot of history suggests they might have been, let's just say, sitting on the bench a little more than advertised.
So stick around. We're going to pick apart the spin, the myth-making, and that whole "we totally did that" attitude. This isn't just a history lesson. It's about learning why history textbooks should probably come with warning labels. And of course, none of this would be possible without our producer, FireflyHaku, who, unlike some folks we'll be talking about, doesn't rewrite history, he just edits our mess into something worth listening to.
All right, first up, a contested victory. China celebrates its WW2 win with these huge, elaborate military parades. But the story of who actually earned that victory? Well, to put it mildly, it's complicated.
And here it is, the official line you'll hear from Beijing today. The Chinese Communist Party was the mainstay, the central pillar that held up the entire resistance against Japan. This one claim, it's the foundation of their entire modern narrative. And it's the very thing we're going to put right under the microscope.
So, to really understand that claim, you have to look at the other major player on the field, the Kuomintang, or KMT. Now, at the time, they were the internationally recognized government of China, and their army was the one staring down the full might of the Imperial Japanese Army. You know, the numbers here, they really tell a story all on their own. The source material lays out this incredibly stark contrast. The KMT fought 22 major, large-scale battles. The CCP? Just one. The 100 Regiments Offensive? And get this, its commander was later criticized by Mao for even doing that much. And then there's the human cost.
Over 3 million KMT soldiers became casualties. Just let that number sink in. That's more than the entire population of many countries. 206 of their generals died in action. This was the army on the front lines, taking the absolute brunt of the Japanese war machine in these massive, grinding battles like the Battle of Shanghai and the defense of Wuhan.
So you have to ask, right? If the CCP wasn't fighting most of the big battles, what were they doing? Well, turns out they had a very different internal policy, a strategy that kind of reveals their true priority. It was called the 7-2-1 strategy.
Let's break this down, because it's wild. 70% of their effort, 70, was for development, meaning expand their own forces, grab more territory. 20% was for appeasement, basically playing politics and dealing with the KMT government. And that leaves just 10%, 10, for actually fighting the Japanese. Resisting the invasion was literally the lowest priority on their list.
And look, this wasn't some abstract idea. It came straight from the top. According to the memoirs of CCP co-founder Zhang Gutao, Mao Zedong himself set this tone way back in 1937. He explicitly told his cadres not to get swept up in patriotic fever. He told them the main goal was to preserve and expand their own strength, not to become heroes on the front line.
This quote right here just brilliantly illustrates the whole mindset. This was recorded by the head of the Communist International in his diary. Mao's instructions were to create the appearance of fighting, just enough to make their supposed allies in the KMT think they were pulling their weight, but not enough to attract the full, devastating force of the Japanese army. It was pure preservation and opportunism.
So, did this strategy work? Oh, absolutely. The results were just staggering. At the start of the war in 1937, the CCP had less than 50,000 troops. By the end, in 1945, they had a force of over 1.2 million, plus millions more in local militias. They went from a small patch of land to controlling territory with 100 million people. So while the KMT's best armies were being bled dry on the battlefield, the CCP was quietly growing into the powerhouse that would eventually win the civil war that followed.
Okay, now there's another massive piece of the puzzle that gets, let's say, conveniently left out of the CCP's victory story, the United States. The source material argues that to talk about Japan's defeat without mentioning America, well, it's just a fundamentally dishonest story.
I mean, the American war effort is what truly broke the back of the Japanese Empire. The U.S. Navy's blockade cut off the island nation from over 90% of its resources. Oil, steel, everything. Strategic bombing leveled its industrial core. The brutal island-hopping campaign in the Pacific just annihilated its navy.
The famous hump airlift over the Himalayas kept the KMT supplied and in the fight. And then, of course, the atomic bombs, which forced the unconditional surrender. These were the decisive war-ending actions. So why? Why go to all the trouble of creating this myth? Why rewrite history so completely? The answer, as it so often is politics. It's all about one word: legitimacy.
This timeline is fascinating. For decades after the war, the CCP barely even mentioned Victory Day. You gotta ask why, right? Because celebrating it meant admitting their old enemies, the KMT and the US, were the main victors. But then, after the Cold War, when the old communist ideology was fading, they needed something new to rally around. Nationalism, centered on the anti-Japanese struggle, was the perfect fit. And so the celebrations and the narrative just got bigger and bolder over time.
So how'd they do it? The revisionist toolkit basically had three key tools. First, conceptual theft. They reframed whole war as a united front led by them, making the actual government look like a junior partner. Second, shifting focus. Pop culture got flooded with movies and stories about heroic guerrilla fighters in tunnels, which drew everyone's attention away from the huge, bloody battles fought by the KMT. And third, hijacking emotion. They took the very real, very raw trauma of the war, like the Nanjing Massacre, and spun it so the only possible conclusion was that only the CCP could save China.
There's this powerful line from a scholar named Yan Fu, written a century ago. It starts with fabrication and ends in shamelessness. It begins with small, careful lies to serve a political purpose. And once you have absolute power, you don't even have to pretend anymore. The lie can just be declared as the truth for the whole world to see.
And on that note, you know what to do. Subscribe, or we'll start making our own official version of Why You Didn't. Thanks for hanging out. Share the podcast love, and come back for round 2.